On the 3rd of July 1968, the Beatles stepped into EMI Studios in London to record Paul McCartney's Obla-Di Obla-Da. They wouldn't finish the song until the 15th of July, spending over 42 hours on this single track for the White Album. Not long before this, the Beatles would have smashed out an entire album in 42 hours. This process involved completely scrapping and redoing the song multiple times, which just added to the already high tensions between the Beatles at that point. The recording process of this song reportedly even caused John Lennon to storm out. And that's especially interesting when you listen to the song, which is so light-hearted and jolly. You can even hear the Beatles laughing away in the mix. But according to engineer Geoff Emerick, this was a McCartney composition that Lennon openly and vocally detested. And both John Lennon and George Harrison vetoed its single release in the UK. More on that later, but first, what does Obla-Di Obla-Da actually mean? Well, the phrase came from a Nigerian bongo player Paul had met in the London club scene. His name was Jimmy Scott. I used to love this expression. Every time we met, he'd say, Obla-Di Obla-Da, life goes on, brah. According to Paul, however, Jimmy wasn't exactly happy when he learnt it was being used in a Beatles song. Jimmy wanted a cut from it. Paul would end up paying Jimmy some money, but not for the use of the catchphrase. According to the Beatles biographer Steve Turner, Jimmy was actually arrested for failing to pay maintenance to his ex-wife. Jimmy told the police to contact the Beatles office to see if Paul McCartney would pay for his legal bill. And Paul did, on the condition that Jimmy dropped the whole thing with the use of his catchphrase. Paul would write the song properly while the Beatles were in India in the spring of 1968, taking part in a transcendental meditation course under Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. This is a well-documented period of time for the Beatles, so I won't go into too much detail, but it was on this retreat that the song started to piece together. Paul would sing the song with his guitar while walking with Maharishi, and according to Paul, Maharishi liked the song. And as for the narrative in the song, it's a fantasy about a fictional couple named Desmond and Molly who fall in love, get married, have kids, and happily live out their everyday life together. And this wasn't new for Paul McCartney. I mean, take Eleanor Rigby, for example, or Lovely Rita. McCartney often wrote about fictional characters as part of his songwriting process. As for the music itself, McCartney was keen early on to have the song reflect the sort of groove he'd heard on ska records in the 60s, heard in a lot of nightclubs in London at that time. Songs like My Boy Lollipop by Millie Small in 1964. Or 007 Shantytown by Desmond Dekker and the Aces. In fact, in Paul's more recent book, The Lyrics, he says that Desmond in the song might actually be based on Desmond Dekker. There you go. Back from India, in late May of 1968, the Beatles gathered at George Harrison's home in Surrey to record some demos. The day after, they would head to EMI to officially begin work on what would become the White Album. There, in Harrison's home, they recorded a simple version of the song on acoustic guitar, as well as some tambourine and maracas. Just over a month later, the Beatles started work on the song in EMI Studios. Now, the first day's session ran from 8 p.m. to 3:15 a.m. They laid down a rhythm track with Paul, John and George on acoustic guitars and Ringo on drums. There were 7 takes in total, and McCartney was finding it really difficult to nail down his vision for the song. He was convinced take 7 was the best of that day and performed overdubs for that take before actually realising that take 3 had been the best overall. So he scrapped take 7 and focused on take 3 instead. Happy ever after in the marketplace, Desmond lets the children lend a hand. And you can start to see Paul's obsessiveness over this song already. It gets worse though, just you wait. Over the next 2 days, under Paul's direction, they continued to add overdubs, including John and George's backing vocals, as well as percussion with maracas and a cowbell. Paul even brought in session musicians to add to the track. 3 saxophonists and someone very special to play the bongos, Jimmy Scott himself. And at this early point in the recording, Lennon was enjoying the process, because it gave him a chance to clown around with his silly voices. However, things started to unravel from there. The recording process for this song had already dragged on over 3 nights. Paul wasn't happy with the rhythm of the track, or with his vocal performance. He didn't think the track had captured that ska or reggae feeling that he wanted for the song. He was getting frustrated with himself as much as he was with everyone else, especially John Lennon. At this point in the Beatles' career, Lennon and McCartney weren't exactly on good terms, to put it lightly. Lennon was deeply entrenched in his relationship with Yoko Ono and had become addicted to heroin. Paul and John weren't having legitimate musical differences. Instead, they seemed to be saying, "I don't like what you're suggesting, because I don't like you." They weren't necessarily angry at each other, but you could see that both were highly frustrated. Within what had once been a close-knit group, there was no longer any sense of team or unity. According to Jeff, during these sessions, Lennon was experiencing severe mood swings, engaged and doing his silly voices 1 minute, and then sulking and complaining about Paul's granny music the next. And none of this was helped by what Paul did next. Over the next few days, he decided to scrap the entire thing and start again from scratch. All of those takes, overdubs, session musicians, in the bin. And this was a first for the Beatles, to restart a song that had had so much time and money spent on it already. You can imagine the tension in that studio after that decision was made. On July the 8th, when the other Beatles heard the news, John went ballistic, according to Geoff Emerick. It was at that moment that he stormed out of the studio with Yoko Ono. Amazingly, though, he returned a few hours later. "I am stoned," John Lennon bellowed from the top of the stairs. And this, Lennon added with a snarl, is how the song should go. Unsteadily, he lurched down the stairs and over to the piano, and began smashing the keys with all his might, pounding out the famous opening chords that became the song's introduction, played at a breakneck tempo. A very upset Paul got right in Lennon's face. For a moment I thought fists might fly. However, McCartney remembers that moment a lot differently. In his book Many Years From Now, he describes how Ringo and George were in the studio with him and that he was struggling with his acoustic guitar version of the song. Lennon then arrived late and was in a very good mood. He sat down at the piano and instantly played the ska-style intro. And that is what turned the whole song around. I remember the two of us in the studio having a whale of a time. Very different to how Emerick described it. And I do wonder whether a lot of how Paul talks about John after his death is to protect his legacy in some way, as if he doesn't want people to remember him in a negative light. What do you think? But then again, when you listen to the final song, it does sound like they're having a whale of a time. It's a tricky one. Either way, the song had finally been sussed out with John's keys, and things were back on track. 12 live tracks were performed, overdubs, all the rest of it, and a rough mix was created by George Martin, Geoff Emerick, and engineer Richard Lush. Finally, they could put this one to bed. Except, they couldn't. Because the next morning, McCartney decided again that the song wasn't good enough, and it needed to be started from scratch again. So, July 9th, the Beatles met much earlier, in the afternoon this time, and in Studio 3 rather than Studio 2. Ringo must not have gotten the message because he was nowhere to be found for this session. And so Paul got behind the drums and led Lennon and Harrison, furious at this point, through some more run-throughs. 21 takes later, yeah, 21, Paul eventually gave in. Ringo eventually turned up around 10 p.m, and all four got to work in getting this track over the finish line. Over the next few days, session musicians, including saxophonists, were brought in. On July 15th, Paul McCartney worked on a final overdub for his vocals, a process which again seemed to take forever. It seemed impossible for Paul to be satisfied, and this led to some serious tension between him and George Martin. In sheer frustration, quiet low-key George Martin actually began shouting back at Paul. "Then bloody sing it again," he yelled over the talkback, causing me to wince. "I give up. I just don't know any better how to help you." It was the first time I had ever heard George Martin raise his voice in a session. This tension would actually cause Emmerich to quit working with the Beatles for 9 months. Paul finally finished his vocals, and interestingly, left a mistake in the final version. In the final verse, Paul sings, and it really should have been Molly instead of Desmond. The other Beatles convinced him to keep it in though, and Paul ended up liking the confusion that it creates in the song's narrative. Obladi Oblada was released as a single in several countries, where it reached number 1. Japan, Austria, Switzerland, and Australia. However, both George and John refused to allow it to be released as a single in Britain or America, due to their sheer dislike of the song. Despite this, the band Marmalade scored a UK number 1 with their own version. Despite the grueling process to record it, the song was very popular when it was released on the White Album. There was a lot of tension recording the White Album, but at least they weren't recording it in a damp, sweaty basement while hiding from the taxman in another country. Because that's exactly what the Rolling Stones did in 1972, but the album they made turned out to be one of their best. Full story on that one is over here.